Good morning. My name is John Donnelly, and I'm the chairman of the National Press Club Press Freedom Team. And I work for our CQ Roll Call, where I'm a reporter. And I want to wish everyone a happy Sunshine Week. Sunshine Week occurs every year around mid-March, and it's time to coincide with James Madison's birthday. And it's an opportunity for us, especially in the journalism world, to spotlight the importance of government transparency and press access. Today's event, which is brought to you by the Press Freedom Team of the Press Club and the National Press Club Journalism Institute, our nonprofit affiliate, is focused on increasing that disinfecting sunlight in our public life. And we have two really great guests today to talk about this issue. Nabiha Syed is president of the Markup, which is a nonprofit newsroom of data-driven journalists focusing on technology's impact on society. Nabiha, before joining the Markup, was vice president and associate general counsel at BuzzFeed, where she counseled on issues like news gathering, libel, and privacy matters worldwide. Prior to that, she co-founded the nation's first media access law clinic, currently in its 10th year of operation at Yale Law School. She also served as a First Amendment fellow at the New York Times. Ron Nixon is also with us today. Ron is Global Investigations Editor at the Associated Press. Prior to that, he had been Homeland Security correspondent at the New York Times. He wrote a book called Selling Apartheid, South Africa's Global Propaganda War. And he's the co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society, which trains journalists of color in investigative reporting. So to give you an overview of what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about three main topics. One, how journalists can pry open the government to get more information. Two, why diverse newsrooms are so important to that work. And three, we're going to talk about some of the threats that journalists face today. Quick word on format before we get started. We are recording this event and we will send out to you today a recording of it. We plan to be here about 45 minutes or so, and we want it to be an informal conversation, and we invite you to participate in the audience. If you want to submit a question for us to ask Nabiha or Ron or both, please put it in the Q&A space here on the Zoom platform. And I suggest you don't wait until the end to put your question in so we can make sure I can weave them in as best as possible. So with that, I want to get on with it and talk about the first issue, which is transparency and access. Getting information from the government, especially when the government doesn't want you to have it, is the supreme challenge for journalists. And we have two people here today who know a heck of a lot about that subject. And I'd like you both to weigh in on it, but I want to start with Nabiha and just ask you, and to get it started in a broad sense, what has your experience been in trying to get information out of the government? And in particular, how has obtaining public information changed perhaps in recent years?
Thank you so much, John. And thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and be able to celebrate a great week like Sunshine Week after a very strange year, I think, for public records. So there's a lot that's been happening in the public records universe. By way of background, I'll say, our team at the Markup engages in a lot of different kinds of news gathering work, of which public records is a slice. And we've done a lot of work on the state level, and less so on the federal level, which is where I've done a lot of work in my previous life as a media lawyer. So on the state level, it has been fascinating over the last year, particularly in one arena that's close to the Markup's heart, close to my heart, which is looking at what happens when state governments, the actual state or cities, localities, decide to outsource to private companies core critical functions. Right? This has been a strange year for operating in a variety of ways. But that act of saying, oh, here's a private vendor, here's a contractor, they'll do the work for us, they'll get it done efficiently, cloaks our access to records in a way that is very serious that I wish more people were looking at. And so at the Markup, we're the beneficiaries of a generous grant from Rutgers, where we've been doing a 50 statewide survey, filing public records requests in every state, asking for contracts between a particular private company that we're looking at and a state agency. And the results have been everything from, hey, we're not in the office, so we actually don't have access to what you're asking for. So practical obstacle. We can't get email responses from the people who actually do know this because we're not in the office and we can't walk down the hallway. Another practical obstacle. Oh, I'm so sorry. Is that a private company? That is a trade secret, which is an area of the law that's expanded dramatically in the last couple of years because of a Supreme Court case, the Argus Leader case, that on the federal level created a pretty broad way to carve out, to interpret trade secrets, and broadening it up from its history that's now trickling down to states. That's a legal obstacle. And then there's my, the favorite, tried and true, no response, just no one's home, no one's there, another practical obstacle. And then also confusion, right? When people are like, how are you asking me for this document that belongs to that private company? You're like, well, you chose to contract it out, so I think you got to give us something here. And so that's to say the terrain is sort of, it has these practical obstacles, it has legal hurdles that I think have like ramped up in this arena. And all the while, the public knows less and less about what its government is doing because private actors are taking up the slack. And so it's been a really strange time.
Indeed. Ron, have you had any similar, I don't know to what extent, I imagine most of your work is federal as opposed to state, but correct me if I'm wrong. Have you seen a similar, situation there with regard to private companies, denying reporters access?
We haven't, my team and he as a whole hasn't really dealt with that issue. I do know that it is there. And I also have had some experience with it over the years. I think it's just gotten worse. And they have started to outsource more and more. This whole idea of reinventing government and the private sector can do it better than the public sector has really taken off rather. And that's sort of prevailing wisdom behind some of this. Some of it is intentional, just to say that, well, it's not really ours. I mean, it's the private companies. And so there's that area that you've got to negotiate. Mainly, though, where we have been working is on the federal level. And that has been worse, partially due to the pandemic, but I also think that it's just the nature of the way that governments are, regardless of who's in power. I've been in Washington in dealing with this since the Bush administration. And, you thought, well, okay, the Obama administration is coming in and they're going to be more open. They weren't. And then you were thinking, well, the Trump administration, they're going to be, well, they were, it just progressively gets worse. And regardless of the administration or the intent. And part of that is that what the pandemic has exacerbated is, if you look at the agencies and the entities that are most responsible for providing transparency and openness for government, they're the least resource. It means they have the least amount of people, they have the least amount of money. And so I don't know if it's the intent, but that's just the what you see both at the federal and state level, that there just isn't a lot of money put into this, no matter what people are saying about openness or transparency. So you just see that throughout both federal and state government. I think one of the biggest things that we and other news organizations dealt with last year was the Paycheck Protection Program. It's this massive, massive program, trillions of dollars. And the idea that they weren't going to put out anything about who actually got the money or how much or where they're located, which just seems like that's just crazy. I mean, how could you not? And so the AP, along with the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Center for Investigative Reporting, Wall Street Journal, and several other media organizations have to sue to get at that information. And there's a recent um, uh, attempt now to say that, well, this information shouldn't be public. And so I think what we're seeing here is the darkening, so to speak, of government operations, and an attempt to keep the public from knowing what's going on, because what you hear a lot is, oh, well, the public doesn't care about this stuff. Only you guys in the media care about this stuff. And that's not true. I mean, people do care about this stuff.
Once they find out about it, right?
Find out about it. You know, because I know when we've written about like who's getting money under the Paycheck Protection Program, the first thing we had to do was figure out how to do it without getting government information by going through the information that was public. And people were outraged that you had, like, you know, publicly traded companies with like millions of dollars in assets getting money, and little tiny companies that the program was set up for weren't getting money. So yeah, people are outraged when they do find out about this stuff.
Right, exactly. Of course, they're not outraged about something they don't know about yet.
Right, exactly.
So what, as you said, the problem's getting worse. I mean, is there anything in particular that you see, any like response that you're seeing more often on FOIAs, or just public affairs responses that you're seeing that they're going to more often? In other words, like in what particular ways are they manifesting this worsening? Or if you want to look at it from the more positive side, what can reporters do to overcome these obstacles?
So let me deal with both of those. One is what we see a lot is we'll file a FOIA for information and it'll come back and say it's overly broad. And you're as specific as how could this be overly broad? And so when you try to negotiate, it's like they try to negotiate down to give you the least amount of information possible, which is not, you know, what we want. And so I tell people all the time, and that you appeal everything, you know, every single thing you appeal it, right? And go through that process and make them tell you why they can't give you this information, or why this is overly broad. And look, let's be clear. I don't want to just file something and say, okay, give me everything you've got, right? Yes, that's overly broad, and reporters should not do that. We should do some reporting to figure out what actually we need, because those folks are overwhelmed. And as I mentioned before, they are under-resourced and they're understaffed. And so, yes, they can get overwhelmed, and you don't want to just file FOIAs just to say everything. But at the same time, what you do want is not to engage in these conversations about, can you narrow this, or can you narrow that? Because they're determining what you get, they're trying to keep you from getting certain information. And again, I don't know if that's intent, their laziness, I don't know, and I don't want to speculate. On the other hand, what can reporters do about it? I think one of the things, and we've you know, had conversations inside the AP, and I've had conversations with other friends throughout the media, is that we need to be more what I call offensive with FOIA. And that is, we need to be going after stuff all the time to get people used to the idea that we're going to be asking for this stuff. And you've got to respond, that this is not a one-off. This is not something that we're going to ask for, you know, once every 6 months, or maybe once a year. We're going to be doing this all the time. So you need to get ready for us to do it. And again, you know, not to go and ask for a blanket, like, give me everything the agency has, but to very specific information, like again, in the Paycheck Protection Program, I think we were very specific about what we wanted: names, addresses, the amounts that people got. You know, I think those things are reasonable.
Right, absolutely. So Nabiha, I'm curious whether you think it's time to revisit FOIA in Congress. Do you think that, do you think this law could use an updating to sort of, do something about the ways that the exemptions that exist there now are being broadened? For example, the trade secrets thing. Do you think there's any? I mean, we're reporters, but so we don't do lobbying. But it seems to me like an obvious question. It's been a what? I mean, it was in the, what 60s in the 60s when it was first enacted. Maybe it's been updated since then. But what do you think about that question?
I want to answer that, and then I want to go back for some tips too from Ron. So keep me honest on that one. In terms of congressional solutions, that might require more optimism in the congressional process than I currently have. But in an ideal world, absolutely. In an ideal world, we need to revisit the reality that we're in and say, for example, on the trade secrets front, it is just the reality of operations these days that private actors play a part in providing services to everyday Americans. That's just real. So let's create some mechanism of access in that arena. It is just the case that most people they don't know how to write an appeal. They don't know how to file a lawsuit. They barely know they can even file a public records request. So as part of revitalizing democracy and our understanding of civic responsibility, we should be having these trainings at libraries. Also, maybe fund libraries. There's a lot that I would ask for in this bill that I think goes to the heart of a lot of the political problems we're having. But I think the political landscape for a FOIA update, I'm a little pessimistic that that's possible. I do think that on the federal level, there is just the value of clarifying a lot of bits of the law would be so important, because I see the trickle down to how states interpret their laws based on what's happening on the federal level, right? In so many states, they explicitly look to the federal interpretations of concepts like trade secrets or privacy or law enforcement exemptions. And so I think that is helpful. What I will say is I think the states are a really interesting laboratory for experimentation. And so you have things like in New York, through legislative pressure and the timing around the George Floyd protests of the summer, now a step towards further transparency into law enforcement records, particular disciplinary proceedings involving NYPD officers. Now, people have been trying to get that through for FOIL, the New York version of FOIA, for quite some time, weren't able to get it. At BuzzFeed, we had a lawsuit where we argued the First Amendment right of access for those records. We saw some legislative movement, and now some of those records, when officers have been found guilty of misconduct, are being disclosed. And so I think while the federal level, a little skepticism around whether that'll actually happen, the state level is an interesting terrain. So I would encourage people to think about that landscape. I wanted to just jump on the under-resourced, overwhelmed point that Ron made. That is so real on the state level, right? You have someone who's like the public affairs officer and also a secretary and also be the public records officer. And one arena in which I found a lot of reporters have had success is understanding that these are people like all other people, and they want to go home at the end of the day and live their lives. And they'll answer the squeakiest wheel first. And so calling, emailing, saying, hi, I'm a reporter. I'm interested in this. Not necessarily conceding to all of the limitations that, obviously the press officer or the public records officer will want, as Ron alluded to, but just realizing that in those moments, persistence is going to help you. And also that you're an ambassador of journalism in those moments, right? Like, I know we'll talk about this later, but I think a lot of people don't know how reporters really work. And so showing up and being firm, fair, dogged, persistent, and saying, I need this. This is why it's in the public interest. And no, I'm not going away until you give it to me is helpful, right? Throwing a public records into the request into the ether and just hoping it'll come back has kind of limited success. So I would say persistence is your friend here. And that requires a little bit of hunting for the right, it's not just public records at like arizona.gov. Like, you got to find the right person, hunt them down, and be a human being to them, persuade them, think of them almost like a source, not a faceless bureaucratic system. And I think that is a pretty helpful strategy.
That is, I actually have found that to be helpful on a number of occasions, just to call them up and say, is there some way that I could either before you send the FOIA or even afterwards, preferably before, is there some way I could fashion this, that you think would be more likely to yield an answer? Now, Ron is absolutely correct that, a lot of them are just interested in making you craft your response so that you get as little as possible, but not all of them. I mean, I actually had one of my best sources ever was a FOIA officer who would tell me about audits while they were still in process and say, look out for this, it's coming, and here's a report you should FOIA, and that sort of thing. And I do think polite persistence is good. I have found, unfortunately, during the pandemic, that making that call is not, that no one answers a lot of times because they're not in the office, right? So that has been difficult. Ron, did you want to add anything on the subject before we leave? Like if you had one single piece of advice maybe for journalists to remember as they go through this process?
No, I think the one thing I would say is that you approach this, like as an investigative reporter, I research everything before we actually start the reporting process. And I would encourage people to do the same thing with FOIA, like research specifically what it is that you need, go through and instead of sort of filing blindly, know specifically what it is that report that you come from, even if there's a number for it or information that came from this particular form or information that's collected by this entity, so that, when they come back and say this is overly broad, you can say, well, I'm very specific here. I asked you for a report like N-9654, right? And so this is where your source work comes in, as Nabiha was saying, talk to people beforehand. And, when I go into, as a beat reporter, I would go into government offices and I would look to see what kind of forms they had on the counters or what kind of forms they have on their websites. So I understand what kind of information they're collecting. And so then I file my FOIA and I say, I want the information that's collected by form SB95, whatever, right? So this reduces some of that pushback that you get for saying, oh, well, this is overly broad. Well, it's not overly broad if I gave you the specific report or form that the agency uses to collect this information.
Right. Yeah. And then, I mean, I had an experience of asking for a Navy report where I had the title, the author, the report number, right? The answer was not this is overly broad. The answer was this is predecisional, which is another, kind of area where that gets abused, right? I mean, what isn't predecisional? Pretty much. It's such an all-encompassing, category. Let's talk about diversity. Let's talk about the importance of making newsrooms more diverse, sources more diverse, stories more diverse in terms of subject matter. What difference does it make to the work of journalism itself that newsrooms be diverse? And I guess we'll start with Ron. You co-founded the Ida B. Wells Society, which, as I said at the outset, trains journalists of color in investigative reporting. So tell us why you think it's important to journalism to have diverse newsrooms.
Well, I think several reasons. One, for journalism, it gives you a more complete picture of what's happening in society than having the same people report on things all the time. Secondly, it's good business for the industry. If you want to talk about growth, I mean, you've got like these untapped markets that are out there because people don't see themselves in your reporting. So, how do you expect to expand into these areas? I know a lot of organizations, particularly the big national ones, are trying to expand abroad, but you have this whole untapped market out here that you're not appealing to because people never see themselves in it. And that doesn't mean like, people want to see like positive stories all the time. I think that's a misconception, that people always want to see positive stories about themselves. People want to understand how things work and how they're affected by things. Minority communities are no different than that. So I think you have to approach it that way. And internally, I mean, it gives you a different viewpoint um, to work from, because again, when you've got people in the newsroom who have the same type of education or come from similar backgrounds, then it's hard to see anything else out there. And I think bringing in people of color to into the field of, particularly the field of investigative journalism, only makes it better. And then the other thing I will say about this is that two things. One, when you bring in people of color into the field of investigative reporting, they're not just there to report on issues of race. Like, I've reported on everything, from international affairs to, money laundering to, terrorism. I've reported on all of it, but I do bring a different perspective than some of my other colleagues. And then the other thing I want to say about that is that also understanding when you're bringing in people of color into the field, they are whole people. I take me, for example, I'm from a rural area in Mississippi. I'm a veteran, I'm a musician, I'm all of those things in addition to being the Black guy, so there's a lot that you're getting in addition to just me being, an ethnic minority.
Great point.
Yeah.
Great point. Nabiha, what's your experience been? The Markup has a really diverse staff. You've done a couple great stories recently. For example, on the way landlords screen tenants, how that adversely affects Latinos, how COVID-19 public service announcements on Facebook are reaching fewer African Americans and other racial groups. How have you seen this play out?
For us, for accountability journalism, the reason you get out of bed in the morning is to hold power to account. And you just can't do that anywhere without thinking about everyone who needs to be at the table. And even in the United States, like, race is a huge part of that equation. And so not centering those experiences is failing to live up to your mission. Talking about people, to Ron's point, and not talking to them about their lived experience is just leaving opportunity on the table. Like, if you exist to hold power to account, then you should talk to people who have navigated that power in all kinds of different ways that are obvious and not obvious to you. And so for me, I think about diversity as just kind of it's just core to the mission. It's not a negotiable. It's not a side thing. It's not I'll get to that in Q3 when we have time. You're just not doing your work if you're not speaking to everybody and talking about the issues that affect everybody at the table. I also think it's really important for building trust in journalism at this time. Like, it's not a surprise. A lot of people don't love journalists. I would argue it's because they don't understand what they do. And there's a deep history of also feeling like journalists aren't there to report about you, to report to you, to report for you. And that's something that's really personal to me, right? I was a teenager when 9/11 happened, and every paper I could see, every news article I could see was, why do they hate us? And I was like, am I a they as a first generation Pakistani Muslim American? Like, how do I fit into this? Right. And there wasn't a space for that conversation. And I know many people in the communities that I am from who like look at the media with a real side eye of like, you're not here for us. Now, that sentiment, I think lots of people have that sentiment for very different reasons. They bring different logics to the table. And the first step towards speaking to that is to say, we're taking this seriously. And like, here's what we're doing in terms of not only who's in our newsroom, right? How do you keep them in your newsroom? How do you make their voices actually heard in the newsroom? How do you grow them, give them power? What are the sources that you cite to in your stories, right? One conversation that we've had internally was a savvy reporter brought up, like, are we looking at the representation? Are we being inclusive when it comes to who we are actually citing to? Who are we amplifying? And I'm really proud of the work that our team has done in that regard of being very, very thoughtful about it. And we can, of course, always be better because everyone can, diversity, inclusion, justice, these aren't destinations, right? They're forever journeys that you're on, always trying to be better. So we all have a lot of work to do. But one thing that I think is great about this moment is that conversations that people were having sort of quietly in newsrooms of like, did you see that? What's going on here? Are happening broadly in the public, and we're hashing this sort of messy journey out together. So I think we got a lot of work to do. And we have a lot of work to do, like in media, in democracy generally, but it's at least we're starting, which is nice.
So we have so obviously recruiting and retention is a big part of that challenge, making sure that, you know, if we do everything right along the lines you just outlined, then it should follow that we should be able to recruit and retain you know, all different kinds of people, but it does require a concerted effort. And so I invite any thoughts you guys have on that. And under that same, sort of the same umbrella, there is a question from the audience about how any tips you have for somebody who's just coming out of school, somebody who's just got an undergrad degree in journalism, how they would break in.
So let me, if I address that point about, you know, retention and so, and recruitment. So, you know, when I hear people talk about, you know, recruitment, you know, I hear like all of these steps that folks want to go through, and I wondered like why is it different for this group of people than this group of people? Why can't you say you can't find these people, but you can find these people? And often they're in the same spaces. You know, if you go to the University of Missouri J School, there are Black students there. There are Latino students there. You know, there are other students there. Like, how do you miss them when you're at those schools, or Columbia or Northwestern, or, you know, Howard University or Hampton University or Florida A&M or Alabama State, where I went to school? You know, so where are you looking? That becomes the question. And even a better question is, how do you call, you know, how do we call ourselves investigative reporters, and we can find like secret stuff, and we can get like these sources who know all of it, but we can't find people who want to be found? I mean, to me, that shows in a lot of cases lack of intent, because what you're doing is you're basically outsourcing. You know, we're talking about outsourcing, you know, FOIA stuff to people. You're basically outsourcing stuff to NABJ or IDB Wells or other, and that's fine to have them help you, but people have to get out. Like, you've got to go and expand beyond your barriers, and also understand that not everybody, people don't check all the boxes that you want. I have had a conversation with a friend of mine the other night about this, is that, look, when I got my first job as an investigative reporter, I know I didn't check all the boxes, but someone gave me the opportunity to sink or swim, right? And that's all people are asking for. No one is saying, oh, okay, you need to go do this. Look, just give me the opportunity to do so. And that's what you hear from a lot of journalists of color, is that, well, I've never given the opportunity to do so because people don't see me that way. Why not? You know, that becomes the question, like, you know, all this thing about who's a good fit. If you're a manager, you make those things fit, right? That's what good management is. It's not about, well, you know, this person kind of fits better than that person. If that person has to, I look at it when I hire people, it's like, what skills do they bring to the table that help me do my job better, right? Because I want to win. I want to be better than everybody else. So what skills does that person bring that help me do my job better? I can help them fit in. I can help them with some of the rough edges and things like that. But that's what we need to be doing, not thinking about like, oh, well, you know, I can't find people, so I'm just going to go with what I've always gone with.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we have to think about hiring like we're agents, right? You're looking for potential, you're looking for talent. You're not just looking for experience, right? So often you see these job descriptions or conversations I hear people having like, you know, they were great, but they just didn't have the experience. And to that, I'll say, like, you know, experience is a reflection of chances that other people gave you. So if we're talking about systemic oppression over time, we're talking about people who have felt like they're overlooked because hiring's only happening at a couple of elite schools that have their own racial dynamic problems. You're not looking broadly. Then how are you defining experience? How are you measuring talent? Are you really looking at their potential for what they're doing? Or are you just doing what's easy? And like, I'll say, right, like in a scrappy small organization, I get it. Like, there's a lot of demands on your time. And it's like, sometimes it's like, I just need to get a person in. Like, we need to do this. It has to happen. I've heard that in so many, places that I've worked, and for other folks who are in this position. I understand that urgency sometimes can lead to cutting corners, but I think we've reached a moment where we have to realize, like, that's just not going to cut it, right? Like, I love the way Ron frames it. If you have investigative reporters who can find sources in every corner of the earth, like, put on that same hat when you're looking at hiring and sourcing. And the last piece I'll say on that, right, is this is a network, right? So you really have, it's not just getting people in the door, it is retention and it is culture. Because you can get people in, but if they cycle out after a couple of years, there may be a downstream reason that you can't get talent, that people aren't applying to you because people talk to each other. And so you really have to think about, having like a justice forward organization that includes like diversity, equality, inclusion. It is an investment in the future too. Like and not just like the future of the industry, your org's ability to do this tomorrow depends on what you're doing today with the people who work there right now. And it's a lot of work, but it's time. Like, it is time to do it.
Okay. So real quick, what advice would you give to that newly graduated guy with or woman with a journalism degree, trying to get that first job?
Well, I'll give that to Ron because I don't hire reporters directly.
Okay. So I think that, you should, one, I don't know what they did as an undergrad, but what I look at are, some of the things you've done as a student. And, we talk about looking at, Nabiha talked about looking at this as like a talent agent. And that's what I look for. I look for the things that you've done. But again, that may be about 10% of it, because I understand that it's hard to do stuff as a student. But I think that the first thing is getting that first job, and then doing this work as a beat reporter, right? And taking on things that other people sort of gloss over. And so for instance, if you get your first job and you're covering education, right? Well, you can cover the beat, but then you should also look for opportunities to do investigations. And they don't have to be like stuff that brings down the president. They can be something as simple as like, where did they buy textbook? Who wrote the textbook? What's in the textbooks, right? Where are, who's the vendors for the food service? Why that vendor and not another vendor? How much is paid for the vendors? Just building your resume to show that you can do these kinds of things. I mean, my very first investigative story was finding out that the Columbia, South Carolina, their bus system was increasing their, and this will tell you how old I am, the bus from like a quarter to like 75 cents. That was it. But that was a huge deal because it affects people. I mean, that's a huge jump in price. That was my first, and I built off of that to show that I could do this kind of work. The other thing is to have like mentors in the industry that can help guide you. To this day, I still speak to people like Brant Houston, who's a professor at University of Illinois. I still speak to people like that who are my mentors. Chris Eisen, who hired me at the Minneapolis Star Tribune, because those people are your mentors for life. And as you grow, they also grow, right? So I can ask Chris about being an investigative editor. I can ask David Boardman, who's at Temple at university, about things because I've known him forever. He's watched me grow from like this young green reporter now, but he's still a mentor to me. So that's the thing. Get mentors who can invest in you, help you guide your career, and serve, as a sounding board for things for you. And whoever that young person is, I'm happy to chat with you offline. My email is rnixon@ap.org.
Thank you very much. Hey, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would just just everything about that is perfect. I will say, as a person who took this job, and this is my first time, leading a news organization, I got a really great piece of advice when I started, which is just a way, I think, to sum up all the great stuff that Ron said, is think about setting some process goals for yourself, not outcome goals. So it's not about like, I want to write this great story in 1 year. Good, that's a nice goal. Process goal is, I want to have 2 champion mentors by the end of 2 years. I want to reach out to 50 editors who I think are really amazing, pitch them an idea this quarter. And like giving yourself those kinds of goals that help you shape what your skill set is. Because the talent, you'll do things to exhibit your talent. What you really need to be doing in the beginning is like sharpening the skills that you want to have. So if you want data-driven skills, like, okay, teach yourself some Python, like start collecting those skills. You want to be great at public records? Okay, file a bunch, write your own appeal letters, make mistakes, learn them. And then what you're going to have in terms of your experience is something that you can take to someone like Ron or editors to say like, I haven't had the shot to do it, but I've been just sharpening all my tools in that time, and I'm ready. Give me a shot.
Yep.
Mhm. Great advice. Hey, we do have a question from the audience that brings us back to the first topic about access to government records, and it's a good one. The questioner says that so many government officials are communicating increasingly on Slack and other apps. Signal springs to mind. Are those communications FOIA-able?
It really depends on where you are, but the rule of thumb is if they're talking about, so I'm going to talk about the law and then I'm going to talk about real life. In terms of the law, depending on where you are, like if they're conducting government business, if it's on these platforms, you are entitled to it as a matter of law. Real life is who's going to ask them. The way this plays out, I had a case in New Jersey where basically the response was, oh yeah, we looked on the phone and there's no messages using those terms. And I'm like, oh yeah, who looked? Oh, the person who owns the phone. Okay, you think that they're going to be like, yeah, here you go, right? There was no check on it. There was no like, we have a centralized database and we searched. Like the decentralized nature of these apps, and that's more for like signal text message, makes it really complicated. Something like Slack, if Slack has a retention schedule that you're within, that's centrally located, then the practical consideration is you have to actually get someone to search it and do the work. That's a familiar hurdle. But what I would say about what's really challenging about these sort of, government officials texting each other is that you just, without sharper teeth and sharper oversight, it's going to be hard to get access to them because it just isn't an independent body that's looking at it to make sure. So even when the law helps you, like real life sometimes throws you a curveball.
Mm-hmm. Ron, what's your experience there?
I can't add anything better than that. That's my only thing is that, it being mentioned record retention schedules. These are things that I always take a look at to see like how long they're supposed and what format they're supposed to keep that information in. How long are you supposed to retain an email? Now, the thing about record retention schedules is I don't know that they have caught up to modern times. Like they don't say anything about Slack or Signal or Telegram. So I think, as you were talking about what improvements need to be made, I think that's one of the areas that we have, because federal FOIA is it's 55 years old. In the 66, it's the same year as me. But I think on the state level, a lot of this stuff is just the laws have not been updated to adjust for the times we're in now and these are communications that we have.
Right. So we have a couple of minutes left. I just want to touch on the issue that we promised we would hit, threats to journalists. Obviously, during the George Floyd protests, we really saw this in our faces of, police. There was some violence from protesters, but mainly what we saw was police hurting reporters even after they identified themselves. And so that's the obvious physical, threats. Online harassment is a real plague right now, and I think it's safe to say that women and people of color are even more victimized by that than people who look like me. What form are these threats taking right now, and what are you all in your news organizations doing? I guess I'll start with you, Nabiha. What's your experience been?
So this actually ties back to the diversity question in a really interesting way, which is when I was at BuzzFeed many moons ago, we started seeing this kind of harassment and targeting of women online and people of color years ago, right? And thankfully, we had enough people who identified as such and also felt comfortable enough inside of the organization to say, hey, what is going on here, right? I need help. And we had an amazing security director, Jason Reich, who's now at the New York Times, who really took this on front and center as an issue years ago, right? Because he was listening. He was listening to people in the org that were the first frontiers of this. And so as the issue sort of metastasized and is getting bigger and targeting more people, there's just more infrastructure on how to deal with that, right? And there's now also a variety of different tools, like Block Party is one that you can use, which helps you mute tweets. So let's say you put out a story about white supremacists and they don't love it. You can actually, it makes it very easy for someone else to be monitoring your Twitter feed. You can mute the tweets that are from people you don't know or using certain terms and try to blunt the force of the harassment, right? So these are all defensive measures that you can take, of which there's a lot of innovation around. But the root cause, right, that there are people who are just weaponizing access online to bully people is really, I think, at a root core issue. Like, people don't understand what journalists do, and even when they do, they don't like it because journalists speak truth to power, and powerful people will use any mechanism that they have to hit back, right? And I think some of this is norm setting around like, hey, it's not okay actually to be bullying a New York Times, to be bullying Taylor Lorenz because you don't like the way she talks about venture capitalists. Like, we need to norm set around that. We also need to explain to the public more, like, this is what reporters do. If someone is powerful, they will criticize you. That is in service to the public. That's what we're here to do. We're not here to be PR. We're not here to be cheerleaders. That's just not what this is. And I think we've sort of lost sight of that, and it's allowed too many to attack reporters in a very easy ways using online systems.
Mm-hmm. Ron, your thoughts?
I agree with everything Nabiha just said. Two things I would add. One is that it's incumbent upon the news organizations to deal with this promptly when it happens and not to let it fester. I mean, at the AP, we have Danny Spriggs, who's our vice president of global security, who deals with this because I've had specific threats to my team. And so news organizations have to take this seriously, and you have to defend your reporters and go for people when they do this. The other thing I would add too is I agree with that people don't understand what we do. But I would also add that there has been a concerted effort for years to delegitimize media. And it's not just a natural suspicion that people have about journalists, because you look at the times like Watergate and things like that, the journalism was high because people saw journalists as doing like a public service. But now what you see is that there is this attempt to put journalists into these political tribes. Like, you're just another special interest group. Like, there's nothing special about you. You're just trying to do this. But that's a concerted effort to delegitimize the media by making us seem like, oh, okay, well, you guys are just like the Democrats or the Republicans or businesses. You have your own thing too. And then lastly, on this is that we do have to explain more about how it is that we work, right? Because you see pop culture. I was joking with someone a while ago, when you see journalists on TV, they're like sleeping with sources or they're like breaking into stuff. And that's just not how we do. You know, I've never run anywhere with Julia Roberts. Nobody's ever blown up my car. I mean, you know, if she wants to go and hang out, cool. But, you know, that's never happened. But what you see, like journalists giving false, those are not things that we do. And we have to explain. We also have to explain to people the difference between editorial and the difference between the news side. I remember when I was in the Minneapolis Star Tribune, like I explained this to a bunch of professors at Macalester University, and these were like, you know, brilliant guys, and they didn't know that there was a separation. I was like, I don't even know the people on the editorial side. I could not pick them out in a lineup if my life depended on it, except for the one guy I jogged with. But other than that, you know, so there's a separation, but most people don't know that. And when they see like the New York Times has like an editorial on something, they're assuming that that's the same thing with the news side or BuzzFeed or somebody. And that's not the case. So we do need to do a better job of explaining and bring people in to understand and show them how we work. You know, I'm very upfront with people when I used to like be a reporter. When I record people, I would ask them for, but then I would say, hey, listen, I'll give you a copy of this recording. So we'll both have it, right? So if there's any issue, we both are starting from the same baseline. That's why I'm recording this. I'm not recording this because I want to, you know, take what you say and mangle this. But yeah, we do have to show people how the sausage is made, rather than just letting sort of them hear it from, you know, politicians or from pop culture, watching the Pelican Brief or something. I mean, Spotlight, yeah, but not like these other movies where people are sleeping with sources or breaking into stuff or bribing folks, which is not what we do.
Right. Yeah, I really worry about this because I feel like we're losing this battle, and I feel like the industry as a whole needs to step up and say and really make a campaign out of this. You know, sort of a public education campaign. Yes, individual news organizations, but the industry, you know, industry groups, you know, really need to say recognize the threat. Yes, because the people who are interested in tarnishing the reputation of reporters aren't going to let up. They're actually kind of succeeding. They're, you know, they smell the blood in the water, and so I really think it's something that we, as an industry, as I say, should need to step up on. Any final thoughts on that topic? Okay. Well, we've gone a little bit over the time that we allotted, so I think we should probably wrap it up. And this has been a really fruitful conversation. And I really appreciate Nabiha and Ron for joining us today. And I thank you all in the audience for being with us. A quick note before we sign off. The National Press Club Journalism Institute waived all registration fees during the pandemic, which saved participants tens of thousands of dollars and cost the Journalism Institute tens of thousands of dollars. So if there's anything you in the audience can do to help out with a donation to support events like this, it will be greatly appreciated. You'll be getting an email with number one, a recording of this event, number two, a place where you can go donate if you like, and number three, an opportunity to give us feedback, which we definitely welcome, so that we can improve things like this. The websites, by the way, for the Journalism Institute are pressclubinstitute.org, and for the Press Club, it's press.org. And so with that, thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again soon. We are adjourned.
Bye, everybody.